At first glance, Walter Emerson was a man who had mastered the art of small routines. At 6:07 sharp, his coffee pot sizzled with the precision of a forgotten metronome, while his weathered hands folded the newspaper with a delicacy that only the artisans of resignation know. His house, modest and neatly worn, breathed memories suspended in the photographic frames that no one looked at anymore. Outside, the fall leaves seemed to write unsent letters on the cracked sidewalks. There was a nuance in Walter that few knew how to read, the way his eyes, gray and serene, paused for a second longer on the photograph of a young man with a hardened look, his son. A son who no longer crossed that door, not because of forgetfulness, but because of something thicker, something that is not easily named. That morning, as Walter picked up an envelope without a return address from the mailbox, his fingers trembled. Slightly, an invisible whisper ran through the house. Something, finally, had decided to wake up. The neighborhood where Walter Emerson lived seemed to resist the dissolution of time with an almost haughty dignity. The facades preserved cracks that told silent stories, and the gardens, although somewhat abandoned, still supported the flowers that previous generations had planted. The same steps, the same streets, the same cracked porcelain cup, always placed on the right edge of the table. Life as it was, with its comfortable inertia and peaceful tedium. But there was something subtly out of place about the last few days. As if a dissonant note was repeating itself, barely perceptible in the monotonous symphony of his routine. Walter had started leaving the radio on at low volume. His coat was hanging on the hanger with the pocket turned inside out. And when he turned on the lamp next to the armchair, his eyes did not follow the lines of the book, but stopped, suspended, at an intermediate point. As if he were listening to an echo that had not yet arrived, the photograph of his son, framed in dark wood on the mantel, was beginning to show thicker dust than Walter was used to tolerating. He, a man of discreet manias, did not allow such oversights. His calendar, always with precise notes, appointment reminders, birth dates of people who no longer spoke to him. The day of pension collection had been left open in September, although October was silently slipping towards its end. Like empty houses that seem inhabited only by the persistence of furniture, Walter preserved appearances with an elegance that bordered on the tragic. The envelope he had received that day remained on the table, intact, as if its mere presence imbued the room with an intangible weight. It had no return address, no logos, and no recognizable brands. Only his name, Walter Emerson, written with a calligraphy that seemed to imitate another, firmer hand from times past. Every now and then, his eyes rested on him with the slowness of someone observing a bomb that he did not know how to defuse. Correspondence in his life had always been scarce and routine. Invoices, formal greetings from old acquaintances who refused to disappear completely. But this was different. This vibrated with an energy that belied its harmless white paper. The little details continued to pile up. Walter forgot to turn off the lights. His watch, which had always read 6:07 with Swiss accuracy, now read 6:21, as his coffee was just beginning to drip. The plant in the window, an ivy that had survived decades, leaned withered, as if sensing the dissonance that permeated the house. Even his dog, an old terrier named Bishop, avoided the room where the envelope rested, preferring to curl up by the front door with his eyes half closed. One afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows that seemed to try to escape from the walls, Walter gave in to the gravity of the envelope. His fingers opened it with the ritual delicacy of someone exhuming a secret buried too long. Inside, a single typewritten page, yellowed at the edges, returned a look sharper than any reproach. It was an extract from a court document. The date 1967 was highlighted in the top corner. Under the heading, a word that weighed more than any sentence: testimony. Walter felt the blood drain from his extremities with the haste of someone abandoning a sinking ship. His body did not move, but an internal vibration similar to what seismographs pick up before an earthquake began to run through his chest. The lines of the document recounted a forgotten episode, a testimony that he himself had delivered half a century ago. One name stood out in bold: Richard Emerson. His own brother. It was the tangible confirmation of a betrayal that had remained hidden, silenced, and conveniently buried in the deepest layers of his memory. The echo that Walter had been hearing, without knowing it, now materialized with a rawness that brooked no evasion.
Ow.
The blade slipped from his hands, and as it fell, seemed to cut the air with funereal elegance. There were no screams, no tears, just a slight tremble at the corners of his mouth, as if a bitter memory was trying to escape without permission. In the corner of the page, a handwritten note in faded ink completed the scene with cruel subtlety. Now they know it was true. Now they knew. During the hours that followed the opening of the envelope, Walter Emerson's house seemed to contract, as if the walls understood the magnitude of the discovery before he himself. The document now rested on the table with the indifference of an ancient corpse, but its contents continued to pulsate with a life that did not allow easy burials. The word testimonio was not a simple legal formality. It was the key that opened the chamber of a secret that Walter had double-locked with decades of deliberate oblivion. In 1967, when the world was spinning with the arrogance of revolutions and broken promises, Walter had delivered testimony condemning his own brother Richard. What at that time was dressed as civic duty, protection, and justice was now revealed with another face, that of betrayal. The lines of the document narrated with surgical coldness an accusation that, although true, has been pronounced with the trembling conviction of someone who did not know whether he was saving or destroying his family. Walter didn't get out of his chair all afternoon. The dust motes danced in the beam of light that crossed the room, drawing choreographies that are only performed in rooms where time stagnates. His breathing slowed, not because of serenity, but because of the weight that invisible is beginning to settle on his chest. Betrayal, the perception of it, is a subtle thread that is woven through generations, like imperfect embroidery. In Walter's life, that thread had been buried under layers of good intentions, unacknowledged sacrifices, and a silence that, by dint of repetition, had acquired the texture of normality. His son, who one day had stopped visiting him with formal excuses and brief calls, was now, perhaps right, which he never confessed, knew. There was an implacable rawness in that realization. It was not the rejection of a son because of the manias of an aging father, nor because of the banal disagreements that wear down family relationships. It was something deeper, the silent conviction that the man who raised him carried a moral weight that invalidated him as a figure of authority or affection. There was no explicit judgment, just a carefully preserved void. Walter rested his elbows on the table with a slow, almost ritual movement. His hands, which once shaped wood with the precision of a meticulous craftsman, were intertwined with the rigidity of someone who fears that any gesture will precipitate a collapse. Its interior, however, was beginning to fracture like glaciers breaking in slow motion. There were no tears, only the dense immobility of someone who understands, too late, that certain actions have echoes that surpass the initial intention. Outside, the sky was covered with clouds that carried leaden tones, as if the weather decided to synchronize with the atmosphere inside the house. Bishop, the dog, had discreetly retired to the back room, sensing with his animal instinct the burden that neither words nor gestures could express. At some point during the night, without realizing the hours had passed, Walter sat up. He walked, with the cadence of men who have spent too many sleepless nights, and stopped in front of the hall mirror. His reflection returned no reproaches, only the image of a face weathered by years, with deeper furrows around the mouth and eyebrows than the last time he looked closely. Betrayal, the mirror seemed to tell him, does not always mark the betrayed. Sometimes it slowly erodes those who carry it out, even if they did so believing in justice. The silence in the house grew thicker, as if absorbing even the outside sounds. The lamp crackled slightly before stabilizing. Walter, with measured movements, picked up the sheet of document again and placed it inside the envelope with a precision that was reminiscent of funerals where personal belongings are kept forever. It was not a denial of what had been discovered, but a silent acceptance that the past, once awakened, cannot be put back to sleep. Upon returning to his chair, his fingers brushed, without conscious intention, a small photograph that had remained forgotten on the lower shelf of the desk. It was an old image, in sepia, of him and his brother as young men, smiling with a naturalness that was no longer manufactured in modern times. He only held the photograph between his fingers with the same tenderness with which an archaeologist cleans the dust from a fragile find. In the room, the silence weighed more than ever. There was no need for words. The truth, uncomfortable and definitive, had claimed its place. The next morning, the house did not wake up, simply continued to exist in a ponderous inertia, as if it had forgotten how to feign normality. Walter, however, stood up. Routine has the peculiarity of being the last bastion when everything else has collapsed. He dressed in the same blue shirt as always, although this time his hands took a second longer to button it, as if the fabric refused to cover the skin of a man who was no longer the same. Outside, autumn was beginning to paint the trees with tones of copper and melancholy. But he did not go out into the garden, as he usually did every morning. He stayed in the kitchen, looking out the window at the plum tree he planted more than 40 years ago, and which now, twisted by time, continued to bear fruit with silent obstinacy. The document, carefully kept in the envelope, had been deposited at the bottom of a drawer that was rarely opened. Not because of forgetfulness, but because of an instinctive containment strategy. What is not seen is not thought. What is not thought perhaps does not hurt, but the human mind does not obey such simple commands. At every moment, a flash of the past filtered through the cracks of consciousness. A phrase uttered decades ago, the look on his face when he understood everything. The echo of a telephone that rang in the distance and never rang again. Isolation began as a subtle choice. Walter stopped answering the few calls that still came. The neighbor, a woman with white hair and tiny steps, noticed her absence at community meetings, but did not insist. Older people understand, without the need for explanations, when someone has decided to withdraw into themselves. Visits to the market were reduced. Walks to the park disappeared. The correspondence was left piled by the door like a small tower of forgotten papers. In the midst of that almost monastic retreat, Bishop, the dog, emerged as the only constant. Bishop was a Labrador with a worn coat, whose legs were beginning to betray him with sporadic tremors. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't demand anything. I was alone. Sometimes he simply sat next to Walter without seeking caresses, like a sentinel guarding a fortress that does not expect to be attacked, but does not allow itself to relax either. Was a mirror of the silent resistance that both shared. One afternoon, as the shadows began to lengthen like thin fingers on the parquet, Walter sat on the bench in the entrance with Bishop at his feet. In his hands, he held a small wooden box, forgotten for years. He had found it accidentally while reorganizing a closet that didn't need to be organized, a mechanical gesture to avoid thinking. The box was carved with floral motifs and retained the faint aroma of aged cedar. Inside were old newspaper clippings, train tickets, movie tickets, and a small, uninscribed silver medal. Each object was a needle that pricked a different area of his memory. Small lives encapsulated in material fragments, irrefutable proof that there was once movement, youth, decisions made with the arrogant certainty of those who believe that everything is reversible. Bishop raised his head and regarded him, not with the inquisitive look of someone asking for explanations, but with the mute understanding of beings who have seen enough. As Walter examined each object, a duality settled within him. A part of him wanted to deny that his life had been marked by that early betrayal. Another, more silent but equally tenacious, was beginning to accept that everything that had happened afterwards, the distances, the absences, the unnamed voids, were a direct consequence of that decision. Denial and acceptance danced a contradance without music, while time, always impassive, continued to advance. The box was closed with the same meticulousness with which it was opened. Walter did not shed tears. His face maintained that neutral, the expression that only those who have seen too much can perfect. However, as he kept the box on the highest shelf in the library, like a reliquary that is not consulted, but whose existence is not denied, something in his posture changed slightly. He was no longer the man who believed that the past could be buried without consequences, even if one stopped sewing it. Bishop, rising with a slight grunt from his aging joints, walked slowly toward the back door. Walter followed him leisurely. As they opened, the cool afternoon breeze hit their faces with the softness of a subtle reminder. Life, with all its broken fragments, was still happening outside. Walter's isolation was no longer an active escape. It was becoming a voluntary exile, a pause to rearrange the dissonant pieces of their history. There was no rush. The truth, once released, demands no speed. Just wait. Change, when it comes to men who have remained immobile for long winters, does not usually break out like a storm. It seeps in like moisture in old walls, invisible at first, inevitable in the end. That's how, after weeks of confinement and withdrawal, Walter began to act. Not with epic determination, or with gestures that defy family chronicles, but with small, almost imperceptible movements. Right. Like someone testing forgotten terrain with the tips of their fingers. One day, without thinking too much about it, he put on his leather shoes, the ones he hadn't worn in months, and went for a walk to the town's train station. I didn't need to travel. He just needed to walk the same gravel path he had traveled for years when he took his granddaughter, Emily, to watch the convoys pass by. The station was practically deserted. Only a stopped clock showed 3:17 with inaccurate obstinacy. The peeling paint on the walls looked like skin that had endured too many winters, and yet something about that decadence was comforting. Things that age in plain sight offer an honesty that people rarely allow themselves. Walter sat on one of the wrought iron benches, the ones that creaked at the slightest movement. I didn't know it yet, but that simple gesture inaugurated a thread of reconnection with a time that I had tried to close. Around him, the voices of the past did not shout, only murmured. He remembered Sunday afternoons, when he took Emily to buy candy after watching the trains go by, and how she kept each ticket as if it were a sacred relic. He also remembered the goodbyes without a hug with his son Leonard, increasingly tense over the years, till finally they stopped being goodbyes and became only undeclared absences. That afternoon, when he returned home, he opened a drawer that he hadn't touched in a long time. Not the box of painful memories he had found before, but a black-covered notebook where he used to write down family recipes. Not because he cooked particularly well, but because each recipe came with a story attached. His mother prepared every fall, that of the cake that his wife Mary Ann baked only on anniversaries. And, among the most worn pages, the recipe for shortbread cookies that she made for Emily when she was a child. It wasn't a conscious act, but that same night, Walter turned on the oven. His hands, clumsy from lack of practice, mixed the ingredients with a trembling delicacy, as if each movement were a fragile incantation to invoke something lost. The house, until then, immersed in the neutral smell of confinement, was slowly filled with vanilla and butter, aromas that not only warmed the air, but also the entrenched memories. The gesture had no explicit recipient. Walter did not plan to send the cookies to anyone or receive any visitors. But when he finished, he carefully stored a dozen in an old tin box decorated with floral motifs. He left it on the dining table like someone placing an offering without knowing exactly which god he was addressing. Bishop, from his corner barely, raised his head, recognizing that something in the house had changed its tone. The following days passed at a similar pace. Walter began dusting off old photographs. Some he put back into frames. Others he simply piled on the table, like pieces of a puzzle that he was no longer trying to solve, but that he wanted to contemplate from another perspective. Among those images, one appeared that he did not remember having saved. A sepia portrait of his father in a military uniform, holding him as a child. The image was rigid, the face is serious, but something in the posture of the hands suggested a contained affection, a tenderness that, like so many things in his family, which was never verbalized. That discovery was the subtle catalyst that prompted him days later to go to the local cemetery. Not out of morbid nostalgia, but out of an impulse that didn't need to be explained. He walked to the grave of his wife, Mary Ann, whose worn headstone was still resisting the onslaught of the weather. He brought with him a small bouquet of lilacs, favorite flowers, and placed it with the same sobriety with which a monk places a stone in a Zen temple. There were no words, Just a moment in which his breathing matched the whisper of the wind. That walk to the cemetery was not the only one. In the following days, Walter resumed small visits to the market. He bought bread even if he didn't need it, just to exchange a couple of familiar glances with the baker who didn't ask him questions. He stopped by the secondhand bookstore, leafed through forgotten titles, and bought a volume of Robert Frost's poetry that he already had at home. Just because the edition reminded him of his youth, with every step, the layers of insulation he had built began to crack. Not because the pain had gone away, but because, as an old Stoic maxim taught, you can't stop the waves from hitting the shore, but you can learn to walk on wet sand. The box of cookies remained on the table, untouched, as a reminder that there were still gestures to be completed. Bishop, meanwhile, remained faithful to his custom of accompanying Walter's every movement. Like a silent witness to a resurrection that did not need trumpets or proclamations, Walter still didn't know. Where this series of tiny acts led, I only sensed that, like the old stones on the path to the station, every step I took on them awakened echoes that had been dormant for a long time. But that had never completely disappeared. The past, like the tides that clean and dirty the shore with equal precision, never fully recedes. It just waits patiently for its turn to emerge, sharper and less pious with each return. For Walter, that return came one silent afternoon, when he was rearranging an old dark wood closet that smelled of cedar and ancient dust. Removing a shoebox full of faded postcards, his fingers came across a sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges and marked with recognizable handwriting. That of Marianne, his late wife. He didn't remember having kept that letter. I didn't even remember receiving it. The date, written in faded ink, dated back 24 years. A few weeks after an episode that, though never discussed openly, had opened the first serious crack in their marriage. The time when Walter, carried away by a human and clumsy desire to feel heard and valued, had had a brief relationship with another woman. It had never been a consummated affair in the flesh, but it was an emotional bond that, when discovered, was more devastating than any physical infidelity. Walter sat on the edge of his bed with the letter trembling in his hands. The paper rustled as if protesting it being awakened from its long slumber. When he opened it, a faint fragrance, perhaps a trace of perfume, perhaps just the echo of memory, floated in the air. The letter was neither an accusation nor a farewell. It was a silent confession, written with the sobriety of someone who has loved as much as he has suffered, Marianne related, with that serene voice that Walter could still hear in his head. That she had also harbored doubts, loneliness, and even a fleeting attraction towards an old friend from her youth. He hadn't acted on it, but he recognized that the emptiness between them had not been born from Walter alone. The letter was a mixture of understanding and resignation, an attempt to build a bridge that at the time Walter had not seen or had not wanted to cross. As he read, a dense weight settled on his chest, not like a slab that crushes, but like a slab that preserves, a sealed capsule of truths never told. The letter was an unexpected mirror that gave him a more nuanced reflection of what his life with Marianne had been like. Neither victim nor executioner, just two people trapped in the invisible inertias of time, pride, and fear of revealing weaknesses. That night, Walter couldn't sleep. Images of the past were projected in his mind, not as linear memories, but as fragmented flashes. He saw himself sitting on the porch, with Marianne at his side, both of them looking out at the garden but thinking about different things. He found himself buying flowers that he never delivered. He found himself receiving looks from his son Leonard that, he now understood, were not just reproaches, but reflections of what he himself had projected. Confrontation with the letter did not bring immediate clarity. It brought, instead, a jumble of emotions that seemed to bite their tail. Guilt, tenderness, nostalgia, and a compassion that no longer had anyone to address directly. Bishop, oblivious to the emotional density that permeated the house, rested at the foot of the bed, but raised his head a couple of times, as if sensing that something in the air was vibrating differently. In the following days, Walter began to more thoroughly check other corners of his house. as if the letter had been a key that opened hidden emotional compartments. In a forgotten drawer of his desk, he found a photograph he had almost erased from his memory. Him and Leonard, standing next to a beat-up car shortly after Leonard had finished college. They were both smiling. But what was most striking was the way Walter rested his hand on his son's shoulder. Protective gesture, yes, but also something distant, as if he were afraid to express an affection that he didn't know how to manage. Walter understood with the certainty of someone who no longer needs to justify anything, that the wound between him and his son had not begun with the public revelation of the scandal, but long before. It had been an accumulation of silences, of unconfessed distances, of expectations transmitted in whispers and disappointments cultivated like secret gardens. Finding the letter not only restored Marianne to him with a humanity he had forgotten to grant her, it also showed him the possibility that his own story was not as linear or as obvious as he had believed. As an old Japanese proverb that came to mind without knowing why said, "Even broken branches flourish if given time." It was then that Walter made the decision to revisit a place he had avoided for more than 2 decades, the house where he grew up. It had been uninhabited for years, owned by a distant relative who had found no reason to sell it or live in it. He carried Marianne's letter with him, not as a document that he planned to show to anyone, but as a talisman that allowed him to face a past that he had preferred to keep under lock and key. Upon arrival, the house seemed smaller than I remembered. The windows were sealed with crossed boards, and the rusty fence was barely holding up. But the fig tree in the patio, surprisingly, was still standing. Skinny, crooked, but alive, like himself. Standing in front of that old house, Walter felt that the obstacle was not an insurmountable wall, but a threshold that he was finally willing to cross. I still didn't know if on the other side I would find redemption, reconciliation, or just more emptiness. But for the first time in a long time, uncertainty didn't seem like a threat. It was just the next step. There are paths that are traveled not with the feet, but with the wounds that one is willing to reopen. Walter understood as the next few weeks slipped by with the laziness of long winters. After visiting his childhood home, the idea of reconnecting with his son Leonard became not only a desire, but a need that began to border on the physical, a persistent tingling, a restlessness that did not disappear with morning walks or long silences in his watchmaking workshop. Leonard lived on the other side of town, in a suburb where the houses were all nuanced versions of the same architectural mold. Clean brick facades, manicured lawns, freshly painted mailboxes. Walter showed up one Saturday morning without warning, empty-handed. He brought no gifts, no pretexts, no justifications. Only Marianne's letter, folded carefully inside her jacket. It's like an invisible shield. From the sidewalk, he looked at his son's house. The window curtains were barely ajar. On the porch, a small tricycle rested on its side, as if its young owner Walter's granddaughter Emma, whom he had barely seen in recent years, had been called on another adventure with no time to pick. Walter crossed the stone path with a slow step. Shadow, long and thin, was projected on the main door. Rang the bell and waited. The seconds that followed were dense, like the moments before a storm when the air thickens and the birds fall silent. The door finally opened. Leonard appeared with a measured, neutral expression. The kind of expression that adults adopt when they decide not to show whether the surprise is pleasant or uncomfortable. Without a word, because words aren't always. The first Bridge Leonard stepped aside and let his father cross the threshold. The house was tidy, permeated with that indefinable aroma that only young homes have, a mix of new wood, open book paper, and the sweet trail of forgotten toys. Walter sat in the living room. Leonard too, but the distance between them was an ocean. Compressed into a few meters, Emma was not there. Maybe at his mother's house, Walter thought. The silence that was established was not empty. It was a battlefield where weapons were not raised, but they were all on the table. Walter took out Marianne's letter and placed it on the coffee table. He didn't push it toward Leonard, nor did he offer it with an obvious gesture. He just left it there like someone depositing a truth that no longer needs defense or argument. Leonard looked down at the envelope but didn't touch it, His eyes, dark and tired, stayed fixed on that point while his jaw subtly tensed. Then that the joint memories, those that both men had stored like someone who keeps knives wrapped in rags, began to surface without needing to be spoken. Walter remembered when Leonard was 12 years old and he had left him waiting in the rain. After promising to take him fishing, he remembered when, years later, Leonard had finished his master's degree and Walter had not attended the ceremony, claiming a migraine that had actually been a paralyzing fear of not knowing how to approach him. And Leonard, from his serene gaze, was surely reviewing his own wounds, the times he had wanted to ask, confront, demand. But he had opted for silence, for distance, for the comfortable wall of resentment. No one broke that wall that day. After barely an hour, although the clocks might have melted, because time there was measured in held breaths, Leonard got up and opened the front door with a subtle gesture. It was not an aggressive expulsion, but neither was it an invitation to stay. Walter understood, and with the same slowness with which he had arrived, he stood up and crossed the threshold. On the sidewalk, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, warm shadows. As he walked back to his car, Walter felt a less acute weight on his chest. The reconnection had not happened, but the attempt had left a crack, a fissure through which, perhaps one day, some light could enter. Bishop, receiving him back home, looked at him with those eyes that neither judge nor question. They just are. Walter stroked the dog's head, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like complete failure. Sometimes, as I had once read in an old Stoic philosophy book, the right thing to do is not to get an answer, but simply to have been able to ask the question. There are gestures that do not seek to be seen, but that end up marking the contour of an entire life. Walter did not return to Leonard's house in the weeks that followed. He didn't call, he didn't write, he didn't insist. But every morning at 6:15, when the city was still yawning under the warm breath of dawn, he went out to the porch. With a small notebook in his pocket and his gaze directed toward the horizon that promised no answers. Gestures, he now understood, were not always bridges for others. Sometimes they were the only pieces of wood that prevented one from sinking. One afternoon, one of those that arrive unannounced or expected, it's like forgotten letters that appear between the folds of a book. Walter found an envelope in his mailbox. With no return address, handwriting was unmistakable. Precise strokes, slightly inclined to the right. With the firmness of someone who had always tried to control more than he admitted, it was Leonard's. Inside, there was only a photograph. An image worn around the edges. It showed a teenage Leonard awkwardly holding a fish that barely fit in his hands. Behind him, Walter was smiling. Not to the camera, not to the fish, but to his son. It had been one of the few outings that had finally happened, a cloudy afternoon, where both of them, without talking much, had shared more than their words allowed. On the back of the photograph, a date and a word. I remembered. Walter leaned his back against the closed door and held the image between his fingers with the delicacy of someone handling something sacred. There was no request for forgiveness. There was no invitation or promise. Only the realization that the memories, those fossilized butterflies that both had kept, still fluttered in some corner of Leonard's heart. That night, driven by an energy that bordered on melancholy and gratitude, Walter went down to the basement. There, under layers of dust and oblivion, was his old watchmaker's toolbox. I hadn't opened it in years. With meticulous gestures, he cleaned it and checked every piece, every gear. Next, he picked up a small pocket watch, one he had begun restoring decades ago, but never finished. The dial was cracked, the hands stopped. At 11:17, the exact time when, as he remembered, Leonard had been born. For days, Walter worked in silence. His hands, although clumsier than before, still retained the muscle memory of the ancient watchmakers. With each gear that fit, with each spring adjusted, the images of his child, teenager, adult, crossed his mind like slides without voice, but loaded with weight. Finally, when the clock began to beat again with the soft, steady ticking, Walter knew what he had to do. It was not an offering, nor a supplication, nor even a form of atonement. It was just a a gesture that did not seek an immediate response. He wrapped the watch in a navy blue cloth, placed it in a wooden box, and without including any letter, left it in front of the door of Leonard's house one early morning, making sure that no one saw it. That act did not immediately change the visible course of things. There were no calls or unexpected visits. However, something imperceptible had moved. Walter felt it in the way Bishop, his dog, looked at him when he returned from those aimless walks. He sensed it in the breeze that came through the workshop window when he worked with the blinds half open, and he confirmed it a week later. He opened his mailbox and found a carefully folded sheet of paper. I just said, "It works. Thank you." There was no signature, but he didn't need it. In that instant, Walter understood what Cicero had written. Centuries before, gratitude is not only the greatest of virtues, but the mother of all others. That gesture, small and almost imperceptible, had made it clear that love, although battered by decades and guilt, still throbbed beneath the cracked surface. It was not about returning to the past, nor about erasing what happened. It was just accepting that, like old clocks, relationships can run again if you take the time to repair each gear with patience and humility. That night, the first time in months, Walter left his bedroom window ajar. The night breeze, impregnated with distant jasmines, brought with it a feeling of truce. Maybe, he thought as he closed his eyes, the doors we are most afraid to open are those that have been ajar for a long time. We just hadn't noticed. Forgiveness does not usually break like thunder. Rather, it filters out like the dim light that sneaks through the cracks of a poorly closed blind. He does not announce his arrival with fanfare, but little by little, he illuminates everything, making it evident that he was already there. Before one noticed, Walter did not expect an explicit reconciliation or scenes of long-postponed hugs. His life, woven with threads of prudence and unspoken silences, was not fertile ground for grandiloquent gestures. However, after that brief note, something began to move in the invisible texture of the days. The first was a coincidence that, so precise, seemed to have been orchestrated by the invisible hand that governs human stories. One Saturday morning, as Walter pushed his wooden cart of tools toward the neighborhood market, he noticed a figure he immediately recognized. And it was Emily, his granddaughter. He had seen her only a few times, always from a distance or in photographs Leonard had reluctantly shared years before. Now, she was in front of him, carefully folding some scarves at a small craft stand. Her mannerisms were those of her mother, but the concentration on her face was unmistakably an echo of Leonard as a young man. Walter didn't come closer. It wasn't necessary. He just observed, like someone contemplating a painting he once painted but forgot to have created. Emily, without noticing his presence, finished her work, pulled her scarf around her neck, and walked down the street. But something remained suspended in the air. A subtle vibration reminiscent of the hum of a watch that has just been wound in. The following days, Walter resumed a routine that he thought was extinct. He began repairing small clocks for some neighbors, not out of necessity, but as a way to organize his thoughts. Each gear, each spring, offered him an excuse to immerse himself in the cadence of a different time, slower, more introspective. And so, without intending to, his small workshop began to fill with sporadic visitors. First, it was Mrs. Halberg, a widow who had had a stopped watch for years and who, upon learning that Walter had taken up his trade, appeared with the piece, wrapped in an embroidered handkerchief. Then came Arthur, the former postman, with a wristwatch inherited from his father. None of these visits mentioned Leonard, but the quiet murmur of the community seemed to say, "We know, we haven't forgotten you." One afternoon when the light was fading with the softness of falling leaves in October, Walter found a small box at the door of his house. Inside, a carefully wrapped book, The Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. It was a worn copy, the pencil underlining in margins annotated in handwriting that he instantly recognized, Leonard's, from his college years. There was no note attached, but as he turned the pages, on the first page, a highlighted quote caught his eye. "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." Walter closed his eyes for a few seconds, not to avoid the emotion, but to allow it to settle inside him without overflowing. The delivery of that book was a deliberate gesture, a tacit invitation to resume an interrupted dialogue, not with words, but with shared memories and values that, despite the years, continued to cross from father to son like a thread that was never completely cut. Weeks later, as the season began to change and the first rains of November washed the streets with an earthy scent, Walter ran into Emily again. This time, it was different. She looked at him, that's all. An exchange of glances that, without the need for artifice, recognized a story deeper than any conversation. There was no immediate approach, but in the way she held his gaze there was a seed planted, an indication that the layers of resentment, guilt, and distance were beginning imperceptibly to wear away, as an old Zen proverb that Walter remembered in those days said, "Water pierces stone, it's not by force, but by persistence." The beginning of forgiveness was not celebrated with bombastic words or scenes designed for postcards of a reconciled life. It just began to breathe. In the small attentions, in the things that moved again, in the pauses becoming less and less uncomfortable. Walter, realizing this, did not immediately smile. He just looked down, readjusted the hands of the clock. He was working on and allowed, like the tide that doesn't stop, the recovery to run its course. He knew that poetic justice, the only one that really matters, neither punishes nor rewards. It only balances in its own way. The scores that hearts have kept for too long, at some point between the days slowly slipping into winter, Walter began to notice a subtle change in the house. It wasn't something he could immediately identify, but rather a slight adjustment in the air, an almost imperceptible alteration in the routine that had begun to be woven around him. That was like a held breath, a slight exhalation that pushed without making a sound. A forgotten shadow of the past. It was a particularly gray afternoon when, while repairing a piece of pottery in his workshop, he discovered something that left him with an ambiguous feeling, a letter, sealed and addressed to him, with handwriting that made him stop. It was stored in a toolbox that, out of habit, he had ignored for years. I didn't remember having seen her before. With a curiosity he had not experienced in a long time, he uncovered the letter and began to read. The sender was someone he didn't expect: his old friend Thomas, a man who had been close to his family in the years before the scandal, before emotional distances rose like stone walls. Thomas had been a man without many words, but his actions always spoke with a quiet strength that Walter, in his youth, had interpreted as an act of innate kindness. However, the years had made Thomas's face fade from his memories, until that letter emerged, unearthing everything that had been forgotten. Thomas had left him more than words. In his letter there was a small package, neatly rolled up. Upon opening it, Walter discovered an old pocket watch, one that had belonged to his grandfather, a watch that he had lost in his youth, and that for some reason was never recovered. Apparently Thomas had found it in a house he had bought many years ago, a property that had belonged to a distant family. Someone, somehow, had preserved that small object, and now, inexplicably, it returned to Walter's hands, like an echo of the past that had not been completely closed. The letter was brief. Thomas told him how years ago he had found the watch while renovating a house, but had never dared to return it, fearing that it would awaken old resentments. He had kept the watch, like someone who keeps a piece of history that does not belong to him. Now, I thought that perhaps at this moment, the gesture might have some meaning. A symbol, perhaps, that not everything in life is lost forever, not even the smallest objects, those that contain the weight of past generations. Walter, with the watch in his hands, felt something that he could not easily explain. It wasn't nostalgia, or relief, or even surprise. It was more the feeling that something which once seemed hopelessly lost had somehow returned, as if everything that had been broken could somehow find its shape again, not as it was before, but as something whole in its own scar. The next day, when it was time for lunch, Walter decided to do something he hadn't done in years. He went out into the garden. He wasn't sure why he was doing it or what he expected to find. However, something inside him, a small spark that had remained lit, told him that the time was right. He walked slowly, step by step, to the corner where his son Leonard had planted a rosebush many years ago. a gift that had been forgotten. In time, the plant, like him, had grown at its own pace, overflowing the walls of the small space, hugging the iron fences. Walter, with his eyes fixed on the rose bush, remembered how one summer afternoon he had seen Leonard working in that corner, sweaty but proud, making sure each branch was well cared for. He had never said it out loud, but Walter knew that Leonard had done it for him, as a silent gesture of love, one that he had not understood at the time. The rose bush, still alive, seemed to represent everything that had been carried away by the current of resentments and unspoken words. Walter crouched next to the plant and, for a moment, let the watch rest in his hands, as if it could pass on the heritage of forgotten generations. A sigh escaped his lips, not of sadness, but of deep, serene understanding. The return of that watch, like a silent messenger, reminded him that even when you think you've lost something irretrievably, pieces of the past can return in unexpected ways. And sometimes it's those little objects, those little actions, that hold the key to opening long-closed doors. It was a gray afternoon, like those Walter had learned to avoid during his years of silence. But this time, the dim afternoon light didn't seem so bitter. She was in her living room, looking at the photograph of her son, a portrait taken many years ago when the smiles were still genuine and the hugs were warm. Through that image, the passage of time seemed to have stopped, but reality always has a way of claiming its place. Relentless and full of nuances. In the hallway, the front door opened unexpectedly, as if the universe had decided it was time. And so, there was Leonard, her son, standing in the doorway, with the same distant look she had grown to know so well, but this time something had changed in his bearing. It wasn't anger or sadness that he saw in his son's eyes, but a kind of quiet defeat, as if at last something had broken the ice that had been sealing their hearts for so long. The tension in the air was thick. They both knew that it was not a simple greeting that was expected from that meeting. The silence that stretched between them was longer than time itself. Neither of them tried to break it at first, knowing that any premature word could cause the fragile thread of reconciliation to break before it was born. Finally, Leonard, with a soft but firm voice, spoke. They weren't words Walter expected to hear, but something stirred inside him, something that had been buried under layers of resentment and lost time. Leonard, in that moment, was no longer the distant and resentful son who had abandoned his father after the scandal, but a man, vulnerable and exhausted by the same silent battle that had marked both of their lives. "Father, I've been thinking about it this whole time," Leonard said, not looking away from Walter, but with a palpable distance in his tone. "I know I did wrong. I didn't mean to walk away from you, but something inside me changed. What happened? ... What we discovered was too much of a weight, and I didn't know how to handle it." Walter stared at him. His own thoughts seemed to scatter as he listened to him. The broken pieces of his past were slowly beginning to come together. There was a sincerity in Leonard's voice that Walter hadn't heard in years. And for the first time, he didn't feel like he needed to say anything. It had all been said in that single gesture of vulnerability. Then Leonard walked forward slowly, and, without another word, held out something to her. It was a letter. It wasn't just any letter, but one that he had been waiting to find for a long time. A letter that Walter had written years ago, and that he had never delivered. That letter, lost in oblivion, in the routine of a broken life, was there between them, as a symbol of everything that had never been said. "I found this among your things," Leonard said. "I thought it didn't matter anymore, that it was too late for everything. But now I know that somehow it was never too late to try, to understand." Walter took the letter, but did not open it immediately. He looked at her silently, as if she were a testament to everything he had been waiting for in the dark corners of his soul. For a moment he didn't know what to do with her, with that small, tangible proof of his pain, his regret, his unrequited love. Finally, he slowly slid it into his pocket, without saying a word. As if the letter itself had shown him that forgiveness is not always found in words, but in the simplest gestures. "Thank you," he murmured, almost without himself noticing. Was a short word, but it somehow represented everything he had been holding back. And when he looked up at Leonard, something in his face had changed. It wasn't a smile, nor an expression of relief, but something deeper. Something only the two of them could understand. A kind of unspoken agreement that, although they couldn't change the past, perhaps they could rebuild something in the present. Leonard stood there, in the doorway, motionless, as if waiting for something more. But Walter, without looking back, took a step towards the door and closed it softly, letting the sound of the closing echo in the silence of the house. In that gesture, there was no farewell, but rather the acceptance that, after so much time, something was changing, slowly but irremediably. Inside that house, that had witnessed so much pain, so many broken silences, so many absences, a door was. Now opening that, perhaps, could lead to a different future. There were no empty promises, no guarantees. Even in its most broken forms, and unexpected gestures, life in its complexity has the strange ability to offer peace, but never loudly or quickly. It is a process that comes like a gentle afternoon breeze, not immediately noticeable, but whose impact is profound when it is given time to settle. That's how it was for Walter. Now, peace did not come as a triumph, nor as a definitive resolution. It was a calm acceptance of the scars of the past and of who he himself was. After the meeting with Leonard, the home that was previously full of emptiness and broken silences began to feel different. Not in a dramatic way, but more as if the walls, the furniture, the windows themselves had understood that there was something more than just the weight of history. Now, there was room for something new, though not necessarily a bright start, but a calm filled with small, unspoken promises. Walter began to notice things that had previously gone unnoticed. The sound of water running in the sink, the distant song of a bird in the garden, the shadows that changed shape as the afternoon fell. The world, in its simplicity, seemed closer. He had stopped seeing every detail as a reminder of what was lost and was beginning to perceive them as signs of what still remained to be experienced. Leonard, for his part, had begun to appear more often. Without the urgency of the past, without the need to resolve everything immediately, the visits became more natural, less forced. There was no longer any resentment between them, but neither was there a complete reconciliation, at least not one that could be defined in clear words. It was something more subtle, something that was woven between everyday gestures and small conversations. As if, finally, they had found a point of contact where, although they couldn't erase what had happened, they could look to the future without so much weight on their shoulders. Walter wasn't changing, not in the way the world expected him to change. There wasn't a big twist in his character. His essence was still intact, but his way of seeing things had softened his gaze, as if the wounds he carried with him now had a purpose beyond his own pain. Perhaps what gave him peace was the understanding that suffering is part of the cycle of life, and that acceptance of human imperfection, both his own and that of others, was what made him more whole. Time passed without haste, without the dramas of before. The days were longer, but without the anxiety of lost days. Walter was beginning to accept what had happened without clinging to it, as if he could finally let the water of the river of his life pass, without the need to hold on to every drop from. Time to time, his mind returned to the past, to the time when the betrayal still destroyed him, when his son's words resonated in his chest like an unbearable echo. Now those memories didn't cause him the same pain. Rather, they offered him a strange gratitude, a gratitude that he had weathered the storm and emerged with a deeper understanding of what it means to be human, vulnerable, perfect, but capable of regeneration. One morning, while tending to his garden's small personal retreat he had begun cultivating years earlier, Walter stopped and looked at the soil in which he had planted his plants. The roots, strong and deep, supported the flowers that were slowly beginning to open to the sun. Clara, if quiet, symbol of what he had achieved over time, not immediate growth, but a gentle, persistent blossoming that required nothing more than patience and dedication. When Leonard visited again, they sat on the same garden bench, facing each other with no loud words to break the moment. In the air, something had changed, yes, but not in the way they both would have imagined. In their hearts, the weight of the years past was no longer a burden, but a shared memory that united them without the need to mention it. Walter looked at his son, an expression that was neither victory nor resentment, but simple acceptance. There was no explicit forgiveness, there was no need. Time had done its work silently. It was a space where both could exist without the need to fight, to justify, to complain. Okay, Walter thought, seeing how his son smiled softly. It was all I needed to know. The cycle of pain and separation had ended, not in a scream, but in a deep stillness. And as the sun crept over the horizon, he knew that peace had finally arrived. It was not the peace he had sought, nor the one he had imagined, but it was the peace that had been possible. And as he thought about it, the scent of the flowers in his garden seemed sweeter than ever. Time, relentless but gentle, continued its course, like the river that never stops flowing. Walter's life, marked by the scars of a turbulent time, had left its weight behind, and the legacy of his existence began to be woven into the lives of those left behind him. Although the traces of its history were subtle, its impact could not be erased. Everything he had done, everything he had been, had left a mark that was slowly beginning to transform into something bigger than himself. Walter's granddaughter, Emily, whose relationship with him had been marked by the estrangement of previous years, began to see the man who had been her grandfather with new eyes. He had grown up observing the coldness of his house, the distance of his actions, the unresolved pain that seeped into the corners of the house. But now, as he looked through the old photographs that rested on the shelves, something in his heart changed. Walter, through his example, taught him, without words, that true strength was not what was shown in moments of glory, but what was found in stillness, in the acceptance of the imperfect. She remembered how, years ago, she had been afraid of her grandfather. Fear of what he represented, the man who didn't know how to love, the man who seemed to always be at war with the world. But now, there was something in his gaze that gave him comfort. He no longer saw a man broken by resentment, but rather someone who had known how to forgive, first himself, and then others. Walter had left him indirectly, a lesson that could not be taught with words, but with examples of patience and time. As for Leonard, the son who had been part of the story's central conflict, his view of his father had also changed. At first, rage had blinded him, but now, remembering their last conversations, he realized how deeply he had misunderstood everything. Walter was not the villain in her life, as she had believed for so long. He had been a man who made mistakes, like everyone else, but he had done the best he could. The reconciliation was not an explosion of emotions, nor a dramatic reunion. It was simply an act of recognition, from father to son, from man to man. Leonard began to understand that forgiveness does not always mean forgetting, but rather learning to live with what has happened, transforming it into something that serves to build a better future. Meanwhile, Clara, Walter's youthful love, who had remained in the shadows of his life for years, returned to his memory in an unexpected way. Contact between them had been minimal, but Walter never forgot the days of his youth, when the two shared dreams and laughter without the shadows of bitterness. Clara, for her part, upon learning of the changes in Walter's life, began to smile. Again, not because the love between them was going to revive, but because he had understood that sometimes people return not to repeat what was, but to leave us a last trace of what they meant in the past. Walter, with his wise silence and acquired maturity, had been a refuge of peace for her as well, and although distant, they both realized that love does not always require permanence, but rather recognition. Walter's legacy was not found in material things or in great deeds. It was not an inheritance of money or property, but an inheritance of silent lessons, of forgotten moments that, in the end, became essential for those who had lived them. His legacy was one of acceptance, of recognizing one's limitations and still moving forward. It was a legacy woven through the little things, a handwritten letter, a gift shyly given, a smile shared at the right moment in his last days. Walter was not a man surrounded by wealth or tributes. He was a man who had finally stopped carrying his own pain. and his life continued in the lives of those who had known him, not because his actions were repeated, but because his presence had marked the passage of something greater, the understanding that every life has a purpose, even if that purpose is not always understood at the time. The seed of her story was not lost, but began to blossom in the heart of her family, in the patience of her granddaughter, in the understanding of her son, and in Clara's nostalgic smile. And as Walter's life passed gently into memory, those who had loved him in some way also moved forward, carrying a part of him with them. It was not a heavy burden, but a subtle force that propelled them forward, unhurriedly, but with a peace born from the understanding of what really mattered. The afternoon was slowly falling over the garden, bathing everything in a soft, warm glow. Walter, sitting on a wooden chair, aged by the passing of the years, had his hands busy with a simple, almost meditative task. Patiently, she began to sew a shirt that had been forgotten for months. His fingers, though wrinkled and weak, moved, the needle with calm precision. It was not urgency that guided his movements, but acceptance of the nature of things. He had long since stopped rushing. The sun, already low on the horizon, tenderly illuminated the leaves of a plant in the window. Silently, Walter stood up and walked over to the small flower pot. With a gentle gesture, he began to water the dry soil, letting the water seep slowly, as if his purpose was to let the plant know that, like him, it also had time to grow, to flourish. As he did so, a slight smile appeared on his face, not because of the act itself, but because of the stillness of the moment, because of the peace that was beginning to inhabit him. At that moment, a figure appeared on the road, a familiar face, perhaps the figure of a neighbor or a close friend. Seeing Walter, the person smiled, a smile that carried with it not only kindness, but a tacit recognition, as if he had understood everything that had happened, everything that he had been. Walter smiled back with disarming simplicity, as if nothing more needed to be said. The gesture was enough. That small exchange, loaded with years and silences, closed everything that had remained to be said. In the background, the garden continued to grow. The plant received its water, and the shadows lengthened over the earth. Walter, with his needle in hand and his heart still, felt that the world continued, without hurry, without resentments. In that moment, he understood that it was not always necessary to talk for life to continue, that sometimes the only thing that mattered was being there, at peace with the passage of time, with one last gesture. He left his shirt on the table and sat back down, watching the day say goodbye to a stillness that surrounded him. There was no need for more. Life had spoken. And now all that was left was to keep breathing, knowing that finally the scars had healed,